He was also white, very fast, and prone to running off after anything that moved. All these are facts you need to understand. Being such a regal, noble dog, he was quite beyond peeing in the house and never had accidents. In fact, he'd rather make himself sick than do anything of that sort. While this had made him very easy to housebreak, it had also made him a challenge during the winter months, for it meant he needed to go out even in the worst of weather. During the middle of the storm, the dog begins to whine. Although my father was usually quite the gentleman and doted on my mother often more than she wanted, he would not walk the dog in the snow under any circumstances. It was cowardice, he put her in the cold. Of course, he didn't want his wife out there alone either, and had thus fenced in a large yard. So out goes the dog, who cannot be without a leash or a fence. My mother hangs by the door, something that drove my father nuts, as she wouldn't close it either and waits for him. A few moments pass, and then the dog begins to bark. For those who have been around Borzois, you should know this is a bit out of the ordinary, for they are usually very quiet, timid animals and would rather run home when confronted by something they can't hunt than make a fuss. Concerned, my mother followed him outside. What happened next is how my father described what my mother saw, so it's not even a direct retelling from him. The snow had piled high, and although 2 feet was what they had gotten over the course of the storm, they'd gotten more prior to that. Some of the snow had been shoveled against the fence to clear a walkway, and with the added few feet on top of that, it had made a ramp. Along the fence line, something big moved away, quickly enough that all my mother saw was a streak of white against the snow. It was this that her dog had been barking at from atop this ramp, and when it fled, the dog went after it. Of course my father claimed the thing she saw was the white man, although my mother simply thought it was a cat or some other animal that had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Regardless, the dog was gone. In runs my mother, screaming that her dog is gone and they have to go after it. It's chased something, and if they don't find it soon, it'll freeze to death. He refuses to go after it. He makes every excuse he can. Honey, he'll be back. Sweetheart, it's not worth risking our lives. Look, Pumpkin, we'll leave the door open so he can come back in. My mother's having none of it, though. If he doesn't go with her, she'll go without him and then have a talking to him when she gets back, if she gets back, since it's so dangerous according to him. Guilting always worked on my father, so with a sigh he got dressed and headed out with her. Her holding the dog's leash and a squeaky toy, and him holding a loaded shotgun, just in case. So off they wander after the dog's rapidly fading footprints, my father's stomach doing cartwheels as he realizes there's another set of tracks. A set of vague indents, that only look like footprints to those who know. He realizes he's going into the lion's den after this stupid dog, and nothing less than picking up his wife and running back home is going to prevent it, so still he trudges on after her, feeling more and more like a scared child, especially after the trail takes them into the woods. My father did not like the north due to the weather and wasn't crazy about the woods despite enjoying hunting. My father especially did not like Pennsylvania's woods. They're not like most woods, he would say. They're empty. They're quiet. As they get deeper and deeper in the woods, the trail begins to pick up. The footprints are less filled in, the gait dropping from a run to a walk. My mother's calling for the dog, squeaking the toy occasionally, and trying to convince my father the dog will be just around the bend. This continues for a while, until they're deeper in the woods than they thought possible. It was just like being a little boy again, my father told me. Unfamiliar woods, going on seemingly forever. Eventually, he almost convinces her to turn around. But that's when they hear a low whine, like a dog that's been hurt. She spins around and catches, just briefly, a glimpse of snow-white fur in her flashlight. Off my mother takes after the dog, calling and squeaking her toy, with my father frozen in spot behind her, not yet pursuing. That's because he's looking down at the tracks. There's my mother's, his wife's footprints, and there's the prints of a dog. But there's no vague indents. The prints that had until now been consistent are gone. He calls back to her. Nothing. He can hear her, but she's not going to listen to him, and that means he has to run after her. Every step of the way, she's just enough ahead of him that he can see her, but not call to her, and the path they're taking is taking them further and further from home. Back then, where they lived, the suburbs had only just hit the area. There was their subdivision and their backyard. Beyond that was another backyard and then a street, and across from that there were construction sites and fields, before you eventually hit hundreds of acres of practically untouched woods. If you went far enough you would get to more fields and old farms, but there was nothing but relative wilderness for miles and no other big neighborhoods. It was a very real possibility you could get lost and not be found right away. It was a very good place to lure some poor, cursed fool away. What happened next would be best described how my mother told it to my father. Every so often, she'd catch a glimpse of her dog. Just the snow-white outline of him, or the fluff of his tail. Whenever she'd give up hope, there'd be the dog. Eventually though, one last time, she lost sight of him. It was then that she heard a snapping sound, followed by the yelping of a dog that sounded far too familiar. The sound was carried by the wind, she said, and sounded high and distant, which made it impossible to find where the animal went. Then, there was nothing. The trail ended, there were no more prints. The dog didn't appear no matter how much she called for it. Eventually my father caught up. He claimed the trail did continue, she simply didn't understand what she was seeing, and hopefully never would. For in front of the dog's prints, where they ended, were those indents again. After a few minutes of the two checking around, they found the dog's collar, snapped and hanging on a branch just high enough to seem off to my father. Of course, my mother believed the dog got caught, broke the collar and simply never was seen again, but my father took it as a sign. The debt had been paid for another year. Without the adrenaline of the chase, my parents came to realize how tired they were and how far from home as well. By now, my mother's sobbing. It's too late and dark to keep chasing the dog, and even she understands that, and she's unlikely to get it back with how fast and far it can travel, assuming it wasn't spirited away by a demon, of course. My father's crying too, because he knows they're probably lost and probably being watched. The next hour or two they spend wandering back home, getting more lost at times, before spotting familiar landmarks and eventually making it back. Those few hours, my father said, were some of the scariest of his life. He felt like an animal being stalked, like one wrong move would mean his contract had come up. For while he'd paid it off for now, he didn't entirely trust the white man's word. He had little doubt that if they got too lost, well, that's just too bad, isn't it? Still though, they made it home. My mother, now emotionally and physically exhausted, begged him to do her one last favor. While she went and undressed and got ready for a long night, could he please go around back and make sure the dog hadn't somehow beat them home? That he wasn't whining along the back gate, asking to be let in? Reluctantly, he agreed. Along the back of the fence, he saw the light of the moon. He was waiting to make another contract, his white teeth sparkling in that almost smile. Without words they spoke once more. "Would you like to be free of your debt?" "Well, of course," was my father's answer, even as he got a bad feeling about what the white man may propose. The white man spoke of a rare opportunity. The next year, he assured, could be the last year. No more debt. All he had to do was agree to one last deal, where the white man would get to take twice in 1 year. Something though about how he spoke frightened my father, and after the last deal they had made, he wasn't sure he wanted to agree. He thought about it for a moment and refused. It was then he saw the white man frown, as he described it. It was not like how a human would, but rather, it was if the slit mouth inversed on itself, sucking itself in some sort of alien expression of displeasure. "Well, that's unfortunate," the white man remarked, before simply slipping back into the snow. My father headed back in. The dog never showed back up. That spring, her parents bought her another dog. Another Borzoi, although this one was black instead of white. This dog I grew up with. He, fortunately, was not as regal or noble as the dog before him and had no issue pissing inside if the weather got too bad. Now before I get to the next part, which I guess is the second to last big part, if I'm remembering everything clearly, I'm going to get myself some food, as I've not eaten all day. So I'm going to take this chance to make something clear. My father spoke with this thing multiple times, but it never used its voice. It had a voice, he told me, but it wasn't one you heard and you didn't speak to it with your voice. It all happened without actual, audible words, and things were more gestures than actual sentences. You understood one another, things were translated into rough sentences, but exact wording wasn't there. With that in mind, the white man didn't necessarily say exactly, "Well, that's unfortunate." My father often could translate these sentences better, into things that sounded less corny, but I've honestly not cared much to make it sound great, since the white man was telepathic or something of that sort, and probably wasn't speaking the king's English anyway. Like I said, the following year I was born. My parents did not use birth control. Of this, I am unfortunately certain, for my mother was adamant that we shouldn't make the same mistake when it came time to teach us the birds and the bees. Of course, in their defense, they thought they couldn't have children. Eventually though, a little miracle, me happened. This was something they didn't discover until fairly late in the pregnancy, when all the symptoms simply couldn't be ignored. Upon finally heading to a doctor, they found not only was my mother pregnant, but she was pregnant with twins. Twins were common in my mother's family, with pretty much every generation having at least one batch of them. My mother herself was a twin. This wasn't a major shocker, and my parents began planning accordingly. Everyone was excited, most of all my father, who loved children and had wanted a big family. What did not excite him was my mother's due date. The middle of February. Throughout the year, perhaps cruelly, my mother and more so uncle teased him. His sons were going to be born in the middle of winter. Wouldn't his little boogeyman be pleased? These jokes, of course, didn't amuse my father in the least. As the due date approached, my father grew more and more nervous, although nothing thus far had indicated any issues with the pregnancy. Still, he was just certain something would happen. Partway through January, sure enough, it did. Another storm hit, which caused a few power outages. In the middle of the night, with the power flicking on and off and the storm raging, my mother went into labor. Her due date was a month away, but she was quite certain this wasn't false labor and demanded, despite the conditions, to be taken to the hospital. My father, despite his fear of the winter, snow, driving in the winter while it snowed, agreed without hesitation. He was prepared for something bad to happen after all, and so he steeled himself and headed out to warm up the car. Unfortunately, if the white man truly existed, he had also steeled himself and was quite ready for a battle. As my father left the house, he noticed two things. The first scared him the most, of course. It was those now very familiar indents in the snow, the almost footprint of the white man. Then there was the weather, which would have been the more reasonable thing to be worried about. The cloud cover was thick enough to cover them and prevent any natural lighting. It was bitterly cold, with a strong wind and heavy snowfall. The drive would be unpleasant. The more sensible person would have called an ambulance, especially if they didn't like driving in the winter. But my father felt that for some reason, it'd be safer driving her there himself. That if he was in control, the white man would be less likely to pull something. And so once the car was warm, he escorted my mother to it and began the drive to the hospital. Remember, of course, that this was over 20 years ago. These were new suburbs, outside the city. The hospital was, going the speed limit, a little over 20 minutes away. In this weather, it'd be longer. Eventually a hospital was built closer to our home, but I was born in the recent dark ages. The journey started with a few hitches. The car did not want to leave the driveway. The windshield wipers did not want to work in the slush of the snow. The heat refused to go very high. Before even leaving the neighborhood, the small hatchback that became part of my father's persona over the years slid twice on the poorly maintained roads of our suburbs. But once they got onto open, main roads which were better salted and scraped, everything seemed to be turning up in their favor. Traffic was non-existent, the winds died down slightly, slips were avoided. My father relaxed as much as someone in a snowstorm with a woman in labor can, and that, he said, was the biggest mistake. Ahead of them, it appeared some snow had blown into the road, forming a short blockade. Confident, my father drove over it, and promptly became stuck in the surprisingly solid slush. No amount of backing up or revving forward freed them, and with a nervous sigh, my father had to exit the car and try and push them over or dig them out. It was then that he realized he had not hit snow. He had hit the white man's hulking form. He let out a slight screech, and when his wife asked why, he had no word for it. He couldn't in the few moments he had